I am the greatest.
I wish I was 50 years younger and I'd kick your ass.
You won't do shit. Just stick and move. And just waking you up and saying, now stick and move. Keep your hands up. Welcome to a new episode of the Stick and Move podcast. I'm your host, Trey, and today we're talking about the top 3 greatest boxing movies in cinema history, or at least in my history. And something about me before I get into my number 3 is early in my early 20s, I was trying to break into the movie industry as a writer, as I've always wanted to be a writer. I've had a couple of books published, but that's a conversation for another day. And I always wanted to get into that realm. So if you guys can hook it up, send me a message. I'll write for you guys. But anyways, um, and I've always really been into cinema. And to me, one of the most important things when it comes to boxing movies in particular is that they tend to be uh, rough, rugged, raw, realistic, sometimes unrealistic. And we'll talk about that in a second. But the storytelling usually tends to be immaculate. When I read old journalists like Bert Sugar, there's another one. Oh my God, I'm drawing a blank. But old boxing journalists, they all tend to be very poetic in their writing because that's what boxing is. Not only the sweet science, but it's just a symphony of a ballet performance that even on pen and paper is majestic. And then when you bring that to the silver screen, second to none. And I think I have 3 very important films that I believe are second to none. Okay, so my number 3 is probably 90% of everybody's number 1, but I'm going to go number 3. And that is Raging Bull. Now, look, those that don't know, this is about the live harrowing story of Jake LaMotta. But this film had everything. This film is actually often uh, any type of actor looks at this film as a top tier virtuoso performance to where you want to people look at it as a blueprint and how to act with emotion, how to act with anger, how to even be comedic, and how to have acting timing. And this film had it all. And what I loved about this film is that the moment you turn it on, it starts off with that great shadow boxing opening scene, black and white film, where Robert De Niro, playing Jake LaMotta, is putting on a classic performance in that opening shot. Shot in slow motion with the spotlight in the background. It was the graininess of that film was a secondary character in my opinion. Not in a bad way, but in the point where, this movie was filmed in the early 80s, so it was like we were done with black and white film. But when you watch this movie, you didn't even notice the black and white film. Interestingly enough, this film was almost came out in color. Martin Scorsese, who was director of this film, actually wanted to do it in color, and he was going back and forth. I mean, this is a fighter from the 1950s, 1940s, and he's like, "Should I do this in color?" And the only reason why he committed to doing it in black and white was because the gloves that he had were not accurate in color. It was too much of a bright red, if I'm not mistaken, and he had no other option. So he's like, "Oh my God. So what do I do?" He puts it in black and white, which goes to show you that paying attention to nuances like that could have wrecked the film, especially not only for film historians, but for boxing historians as well. There were great lines throughout that film, like the very iconic St. Valentine's Day Massacre, where it's been known that LaMotta would tell Sugar Ray Robinson, "You never got me down, Ray." The way that Robert De Niro pulls it off after almost dying, looking like he's about to die in the ring, as he's getting pulled from a TKO and being escorted to his side of the corner, comes back to tell Sugar Ray Robinson, "Hey Ray, you never got me down, Ray. You never got me down, Ray," with that taunting, eloquent, raspy voice that Robert De Niro brings to the screen every single time. Look, it was a virtuoso performance. What I also love was the editing in this film. Unbelievable, especially that scene where I was just talking about, where Sugar Ray Robinson was just beating the hell out of Jake LaMotta or Robert De Niro. The cutting of back and forth between the jabs and the hooks and the crosses that Robinson was laying on LaMotta, as LaMotta was just leaning back against the ropes, taking the shot after shot after shot, with the lights flickering in the background. It was great editing. The greatness that was happening within the film was also happening behind the camera as well. This film was just everything that it brought seriousness to boxing films that we hadn't seen in a while, which we'll talk about in a second. And look, there was just famous scenes like the with Joe Pesci. And by the way, phenomenal casting, as Joe Pesci was his brother. But when Robert De Niro was telling him to hit him, to hit him, to hit him, he's like, "Hit me, hit me, hit me." You saw the anger, you saw the intensity. This is when you could arguably say that Jake LaMotta was just losing his mind at this point of his career. Not to mention the scene where he's telling his girl, like, about his steak, like to take his steak off the fry pan, that she was going to overcook it, and then they get into this big old argument about the steak. I mean, you just saw levels of acting, you saw levels of realism throughout this film. And this film just provided the necessary, it felt more like a documentary, where you saw what boxing does to a top tier fighter at the time. And Jake LaMotta was a top tier fighter. As you guys know, we've talked about him endlessly on this podcast. Never went down, and if I'm not mistaken, until his last fight. He just recently passed away. But look, that film had every basis of that film. The writing was spectacular, the editing was spectacular, the acting was spectacular, the directing was spectacular. All forms of levels of that film were perfected. And that's why, even though I have a number three, and some of y'all might disagree, most of y'all probably disagree, that film just had everything to me. And to me, that's my number three film. So tell me what you guys think in the comments. Is it worthy to be a top three or number three, or should it have been higher? Tell me what you guys think. Now, number two is a boxing film that a lot of people don't really talk about. As a matter of fact, I don't think I know anybody that has seen this movie. And it bothers me because in the 1990s, especially in the late 90s, HBO was perfecting its craft. Now, HBO is mostly known for their television hits, right? In the 2000s, in the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, they had great TV shows like The Sopranos, Oz, right? They had, don't judge, but they had like Sex in the City. They had 6 Feet Under. They had The Wire. HBO was pounding out phenomenal show after phenomenal show after phenomenal show. But a few years before that, I don't know what was happening in the production rooms of the HBO studios, but they were perfecting great sport movies. One was this movie called Rebound. I brought it up on this podcast, strangely enough, which is about Earl the Goat Manigault, a street basketball legend known for being Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's biggest playground rival growing up, and he will fall into drug addiction and everything. And he was one of those cases where he had all the talent in the world, but lost his opportunity to drugs. And that was one. They had a phenomenal movie with Don Cheadle. Got to check it out. He was like average height, but he could touch literally the top of the backboard. Anyways, there was another one called Soul of the Game, which was about Jackie Robinson being recruited by Branch Rickey and the Brooklyn Dodgers. But it was much more than that. It was actually following the pace of Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson, where they were the two clear best players in the Negro leagues. And they were wondering why they weren't being pursued. And Jackie Robinson was, if they were clearly the better players. And you see in that film why their flaws were so much determined on why they were not chosen, and Jackie Robinson was. It would end so phenomenally where the Negro Leagues were going to play against the Major League Baseball team, the All-Star team with the all-time greats, Joe DiMaggio, those guys. But then something happened at the end. I don't want to spoil it for you guys, but I'm sure it's available on YouTube for you guys to watch. But the one other one that I love, now to get to my actual number two, I'm sorry, it was actually called Don King Only in America. Now, this movie had one of the coolest trailers where it's played by Ving Rhames as Don King. He would actually win the Golden Globe for Best Actor. And that is that iconic moment, if you're into it or not, where Ving Rhames wins Best Actor. And on going on stage is his first ever award, as he was more of a journeyman actor at the time, where he would actually dedicate his award to John Lemon, who was nominated for another film. And the performance that Ving Rhames played on Don King was virtuoso. It was phenomenal. It was a gorgeous representation as he narrates from the side of a boxing ring throughout the film while they do flashback scenes of him committing his crimes as a young youth to him finding his way into the ring. The film did a phenomenal job showing his savageness, showing his ruthlessness, coming all the way from that, and how he gained it from his corrupt youth. How it even portrays his, what I've always talked about. One of the reasons why I never was a fan of Don King was because the way he wore out Larry Holmes. And this film actually shows that. How he always had Larry Holmes like moving, like, let's go, let's go. Even though Larry Holmes was tired, needed a break from boxing, he forced him out there. And, Larry Holmes at a certain point wasn't the same great boxer as he was. Ving Rhames, that performance in that film was harrowing, in my opinion. It was just, he was made for the role of Don King. Had iconic moments, like you would say the mother F word to a pastor and his wife, telling them what the meaning of that word is, why it's important. Very iconic scenes in that movie. And look, that movie, often forgotten, and to me, is one of the most important films in boxing history because honestly, that it was just great. It's just a great movie. I want everybody to check that out. Now, I did have a rule to this list. I didn't want to do any documentaries because then I would have When We Were Kings and those kind of films like that, The Four Kings. I would have that as well, of course. So no documentaries based on that. Now, my number one and number two is very controversial, but this is more of a personal favorite. And even though it's fictional, so that should give it away, it is. I'm going to do a little cop out here. I'm going to do Rocky 1 and Rocky 2. And the only reason why I say that because it did a phenomenal job between 1 and 2 continuing the story. Literally part 2 picks up from after the fight. But let's go to part 1 first. Part 1 Rocky, to me, yes, it's a boxing movie. the greatest boxing movie, but it's also the greatest love story in cinema history. His pursuit of Adrian was comical. It was lovely. It was awkward as he would go to the pet shop just to do a little small talk with her with his dog Butkus. Iconic names. It had great acting performances besides Sylvester Stallone, who wasn't known at all. People know the story that he wasn't. He was pretty much living out of his car, uh, borderline homeless, writing this script, and it was so beautifully written that they wanted to get Burt Reynolds and all these other guys. They consider all these other guys, James Caan, to be Rocky. And he's like, no, I want to do this movie. It was so well written that they were willing to put an unknown as the role of Rocky, and boy, did it pay off. This everything was perfectly casted. Apollo Creed resembling Muhammad Ali. You know, it's supposed to be supposedly. I think it was Joe Frazier, if I'm not mistaken. Joe Frazier makes a cameo in that movie. Um, but everything was perfect. Even Polly was perfectly casted. Mickey, the trainer, was perfectly casted. The awkward Adrian, his girl, was awkwardly casted perfectly. I mean, this was one of those films, kind of like Raging Bull. It was kind of like the nonfiction version in color of a great boxing movie. It was real. Why? Because it didn't fall into the cliche. And what I mean by that is what I honestly think if anybody else would have written this movie, I think the storyline would have been, in my opinion, where Rocky would not be nervous and he would try to go for the knockout. But what was the underlying tone throughout Rocky 1? He just wanted to go the distance.
Can't do it.
What?
I can't beat him.
Apollo?
Yeah. I've been out there walking around, thinking. I mean, who am I kidding? I ain't even in the guys' league.
What are we gonna do?
I don't know.
You work so hard.
Yeah, it don't matter, because I was nobody before.
Don't say that.
Oh, come on, Adrian, it's true. I was nobody. That don't matter either, you know? Because I was thinking, it really don't matter if I lose this fight. It really don't matter if this guy opens my head either. Because all I want to do is go the distance. Nobody's ever gone the distance with Creed. And if I can go that distance, you see, and that bell rings and I'm still standing. I'm gonna know for the first time in my life, you see, that I weren't just another bum from the neighborhood.
You know, I just want to go the distance with this guy. I'm a journeyman boxer who fought guys backstage of the YMCA sports club. And now I'm gonna have the biggest limelight in history. And he doesn't say, "Oh, I'm gonna knock him out." He doesn't trash talk. He's a humble guy, humble man, and he just wants to go the distance. That is real. That is what makes the writing to Rocky next level, exquisitely perfected. Okay. The writing part, everything from the love language with him and Adrian, with his love affair with the ring, and the training scenes, they were beyond epic. So for that, I have to go Rocky 1, Rocky 2. Yes, I know they're two separate films, but what I loved about Rocky 2 is, first of all, the greatest fight scene, probably out of all the Rockies, probably out of all boxing movies. That fight scene with Apollo Creed, where they both knock each other out and then they're both trying to beat the count to come up on the ropes, right? Besides that, it does a phenomenal job. After the fight, they're both in the hospital. They're both talking trash to each other. Apollo Creed cannot believe what happened. He's denying that Rocky was effective, that he's still the champ. And then what happens? Rocky gets the riches. He starts buying everything under the sun. He gets the house. He buys a brand new Trans Am, everything like that. He gets Adrian pregnant with their first child. And just like anybody else, when you get into that money for the first time, especially back then when you're not an educated person, somebody who didn't even know how to read, which was an undertone of that film, what happens? They went broke. He gets a regular job. Boxing is done. He just wants to provide for him and for Adrian and the son. And, anyways, it just, the levels of realism is beyond what I can appreciate as a fan of the genre, of the fan of the Rocky films. It was a gorgeous display, in my opinion, of telling a real life story fictionally. Yes, were there inspirations to the films? Absolutely. um, but phenomenal casting, phenomenal storyline. Yes, were the fight scenes over exaggerated as I go back to Raging Bull? Absolutely. But that's kind of the charm of it, isn't it? Like, how could Rocky Balboa take that beating? Look, I did a couple of episodes when I'm sorry, when Carl Weathers passed away, rest in peace. Rocky's top five opponents, and I legitimately had Apollo Creed number one. And that is because he looked the part. He had that great jab. He threw those great combinations. He was mobile in the ring. He was a gorgeous fighter. And considering it was a fictional film, you saw the realism outside of the connections that would have knocked out 99% of any boxer. But that was kind of the charm of it, you know? Out of all the realism that was in throughout all those films, the exaggerations of the fights is what balanced the film, in my opinion. So that is my number one. Tell me what you guys think in the comment. The films that I did leave off were The Great White Hype, hilarious comedy movie, The Hammer by Adam Carolla. That's another one of those films that a lot of people have not seen. The Bleeder, speaking of being an inspiration for Rocky, and of course, Fat City. Fat City. A lot of people don't talk about that film. I remember watching it and just being enthralled. Great storytelling as well from a movie back in the 70s. Excellent film. Go ahead and leave in the comments, guys, what you guys think. Any films that I may have left off. If I'm crazy for having Rocky 1 and 2 as a 1A or 1B. If Rocky should not even been on there, or maybe Raging Bull should have been higher. And also tell me if you guys have seen Don King, Only in America, because I try to bring that film up to other people and they tend to not recall it. So go ahead, leave your questions, leave your thoughts, and as I always like to say, don't forget to stick and move, baby.
I am the greatest. I wish I was 50 years younger and I'd kick your